Socrates said that for wisdom we need to overcome deception. For Plato, he gave a description of the structure of the psyche. And for Aristotle, he now has given a description of the development of the structure of the psyche. And he called that the development of your character. The character is the aspect of the self that can be cultivated, right? It's anything that is non-innate, like personality is kind of innate, and all these things, traits are innate, but character is the part that we can cultivate. And he asked kind of a Socratic challenging question: as we spend so much time on our appearance, so much time on our status, so much time on maintaining our emotions or ourselves, how much time do we spend developing our character? All right, so back again. So on to lecture 6 of Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, on Aristotle this time. And as we have kind of framed in our pregame here, this was quite a detailed, kind of intensive one. And so, as usual, we'll start with a summary, and then we'll kind of get into discussing it. The summary will be a bit longer than usual, just because it's such a detailed lecture. Yeah. So he started off by kind of refreshing what we talked about Plato, that wisdom was aligning the psyche to reduce inner conflict, the 3 parts of the psyche. The rational man in the head, the monster in the gutter and the genitals, and the lion in the chest. The lion was the social element. The monster was the monster of desire and appetite, and the man was reason. And that by reducing inner conflict, we could reduce delusion, achieve inner peace, and get more in contact with reality. And reflect those patterns back on ourselves. So there was a deep connection between knowing the world and knowing ourselves. Aristotle studied with Plato for 20 years, but ultimately broke off and was a little bit dissatisfied with where Plato left things. So Aristotle was fascinated by the notion of change, growth, development, and he felt that Plato kind of described kind of a static state of wisdom, but not necessarily the process of growth, and was influenced more by biology than mathematics in comparison to Plato. For Aristotle, he took Plato's idea of the form, and here we'll pause just for a second because we didn't talk too much about that the last time, but Plato's idea of the form, I did undergrad in philosophy, I never really fully understood it this way, right? It was always explained as...
I'm sorry to interrupt because you're summarizing.
No,
I'm a recent student of philosophy myself, and I had read about Plato's forms a few years ago in several different philosophical texts, and it made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. I'm like, why is this written down in words? Because this makes this is not nonsense. Why is this important? And then Vervaeke explains it, and now I'm like, this is so profound. This is such a modern idea. Why wasn't it ever explained to me like this before? But anyway, sorry.
I'm right there with you. And again, through an entire degree in philosophy, it was never explained this way, right? The concept of form or eidos is what he calls it. Again, I want to contrast that with what I was taught. I was taught that was the idealized form, right? So, the most horse-like, the perfect horse was the form of the horse, right? And that seems to not really be what it is at all. It's more akin to the archetype of a horse, meaning the horseness of a horse. And ultimately what that becomes is the structural functional organization that as a gestalt, as a whole, we recognize as that thing. And that's why birds can all look so different, and yet we recognize them as birds, because they have a structural functional organization that creates a pattern that we recognize as birdness. And that birdness that can't really be put into words, because anything you say, oh, they fly. Well, there are birds that don't fly. Oh, they have feathers. Well, there's a bird that don't have feathers. If you pluck a chicken, it's still a chicken, right? And so and yet there is some general birdness that is never lost, and that is the form of the bird in some sense, right? And that's going to be a key concept, is that the structural and functional organization, the eidos of something, is the gestalt pattern that identifies that thing. It is the archetype of that thing, right? So Plato kind of, that's a Plato idea, right? And Aristotle then takes that and says, well, how do things achieve their form? Meaning, if you have a bunch of wood, how does that then become a chair or become a table? What is the becoming of that? How do things grow into themselves in some sense? And it changes by changing the structural and functional organization. In the case of wood, that's just changing the shape, right? You change it into the shape of a chair and it becomes a chair. But you organize the wood in some way into a chair, and that changes it from a lump of wood, right? And so there's this notion that in the wood, and I'm branching off a little bit here, but the wood has the potential to become a chair, right? Michelangelo talked about seeing the statue in a block of marble, right? And just his goal was to free it. It's just that ability, the potential is there, right? And when the potential is given eidos, is given a structural, functional organization, the potential is actualized. It becomes realized. It becomes real, right? So Aristotle, in fact, this is fascinating, created the notions of potentiality and actuality. That's fascinating to me, that those terms did not exist before he created them. They're so fundamental to us. So then he started applying this.
Did you know that? Did you know before?
No, I had no idea. No,
this is what he. Sorry to keep interrupting, but this is why he talks about how we've taken, our grammar for granted, right? We use these terms,
yes,
and we just sort of take it for granted, that this is just how we speak. But there was a time where we didn't speak this way, and I didn't know that those words came from Aristotle. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, just amazing. We'll talk more about that, but so he then takes this notion that living things give eidos to themselves. So it's a chair that is making itself in some sense. And that is one of the hallmarks of a living thing. And he branches off to say this is kind of one of the struggles we have, is the Newtonian view is linear. A causes B causes C, and that line prevents circularity. It prevents the emptiness of a circle, right? And that's why it's so appealing. That creates such an appealing idea, because it prevents a circular and empty explanation. But it struggles when we talk about living things. And here I'm not going to get too much into the details of resolving this, but I'm just repeating what he said, is that, Kant, for instance, realized that living things have an aspect of circularity, is that, the light hits the tree, and the tree grows and produces more tree. And that tree captures more light and produces more tree. And so there's some innate circularity to anything living, and that challenges our notion of causality. What causes more treeness, right? What causes the eidos of the tree? Well, the tree causes the tree, right? And all living things have that self-organizing, self-making feedback cycle. And there was a bit of a paradox there, is that, well, how can we have any science of living things if all explanations are circular and therefore empty? It becomes a little bit challenging. And there was a gap, therefore, between biology and physics, and a lack of understanding of the nature of life, the nature of growth, the nature of development. And yet Aristotle kind of had the core of the idea that's been explained later by some works he talks about. So one of the challenges of the Newtonian view is that it is cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. But it does not speak of the other aspects of processes, which are the constraints on the system. Meaning, he gives the example, if you push something and it moves, or the ball rolls or whatever, well, in order for it to roll, yes, you had to cause it, but it also had to have space behind it. It had to be shaped a particular way. It had to be on a particular surface that allowed it to roll. And so the constraints of the system, meaning the possibilities of the system, had to be organized. They had to have a structural, functional organization in such a way to allow the cause and effect to happen. And that is an Aristotelian idea that things have both causes, which are about events and making things happen, and actuality. And then there are constraints, which are the preconditions, the things that make things possible, the structural functional organization that makes things possible, and that's about potential. Potential itself then comes in two different forms. Or constraints themselves come in two different forms. There are enabling constraints that increase options, right? And there are selective constraints that decrease options. We're used to kind of thinking about selective constraints, so maybe we'll have to talk a little bit more about enabling constraints. But he gives Darwinian evolution as an example of these two systems of constraints being tied to each other. So a selective constraint, obviously, is scarce resources and ultimately death of the organism, right? Like that's the selection aspect, right? It is the growth of the organism or the reproductive capability of the organism is constrained by resources, constrained by sexual selection, et cetera, et cetera. But mutation itself, he doesn't talk about this, but I'm just expanding a little bit. Mutation itself is an enabling constraint. It increases the options. It increases the variation. And that variation is the thing that allows the selective constraint to then close off possibilities and gradually create evolution. And so the drive of evolution is an interplay between the generative aspect, the enabling constraint, and the selective constraint. So there's variation that's created with each new generation, and then there's selection that happens that narrows things back down, and that drives the engine of evolution forward toward greater and greater fitness or connectedness between a species and its environment. So that is what he called the dynamical systems theory, is a description of a set of interconnected or related generative constraints or enabling constraints and selective constraints. And he used other language. So an enabling constraint is a generative, what did he call it? A virtual generator. And a selective constraint is a virtual governor. And together they form a feedback loop that is described as a virtual engine. Right? And that's the engine of evolution in some sense, is one example. But any connection between a virtual generator and a virtual governor that exists in a feedback loop is a virtual engine, and you can describe it that way. And it's a dynamical system in some sense. Sorry, looking at my notes here. So a dynamical systems theory is a description of a virtual engine, selective and enabling constraints that regulates a feedback cycle that produces growth and development. And that's kind of the ability to have a circle, but not have it be circular, right? And so it's almost more, I think of it more as a spiral, right? Where there's this sort of like back and forth, but it's forward progress. And so now he's offered, in some sense, an expansion of Plato and Socrates. Socrates said that for wisdom we need to overcome deception. For Plato, he gave a description of the structure of the psyche. And for Aristotle, he now has given a description of the development of the structure of the psyche. And he called that the development of your character. So, and one of these aspects is that the character is, the virtual engine. It's kind of, there's this tie to virtue, right, which is so brilliant, right, is that virtue is a set of constraining conditions in someone's behavior that is cultivated systematically. And that's a really interesting concept. Character, right. Well, character and virtue, he briefly kind of made a connection there. But yeah, character. And it's the character is the aspect of the self that can be cultivated. Right, it's anything that is non-innate, like personality is kind of innate, and all these things, traits are innate, but character is the part that we can cultivate. And he asked kind of a Socratic challenging question: is we spend so much time on our appearance, so much time on our status, so much time on maintaining our emotions or ourselves. How much time do we spend developing our character in a day? And he talks about then a little bit more practically, and I kind of want to get into this maybe at depth, is the practicalities of how to cultivate character.
Yeah.
Is that, if you take an aspect of character like courage, that cultivation was finding the right ratio. He called it the golden mean, like they were, kind of a Pythagorean idea there, right? The golden mean between cowardice and foolhardiness. Is there's a spectrum where, on one hand you're a coward, on the other hand you're taking absurd risks, and finding the ratio, the correct ratio between those things was the cultivation of courage, and that would be a part of your character, right? And in this case, looping back exactly to the previous discussion, is that cowardice was lack of a virtual generator. You did not have enough the willingness to take risk, right? Whereas foolhardiness was the lack of a selective or a virtual governor, right? You don't have the selection of which risks to take. And so by cultivating back and forth, you need more, you need to expand the possibilities, but you also need to constrain the possibilities. And by doing that cyclically, and you could find the right fitness, the correct fit of courage. And that is how you develop different aspects of your character. And so you can train yourself by engaging in practices that create a virtual engine in yourself over time, right? And so this almost loops back for me back to Socrates and his practices of challenge and response, and challenge and exploration to expand possibilities and then constrain them for developing wisdom. And there is this notion that your actions interact with the environment. The response of the environment itself changes you. And then your self is different, your inner self is different, that then acts again upon the environment, which then changes you, which then acts upon the environment. And that is how the engine works. And so he would, Aristotle, that is, would say that you must cultivate your engine to create optimal growth. And that is, what is optimal growth? Is living up to your potential. And so now we're right back to the idea of human potential. And what is that? And that's by creating character. By building your character, you can live up to your potential. And so he's added this idea that for wisdom, for Socrates, wisdom was the marriage of kind of relevance and truth. And for Plato, avoiding foolishness was kind of having the correct balance between the man, the lion, and the monster. And now Aristotle has added this element of development and growth as being necessary for wisdom and meaningfulness to be moving toward your potential. And it is fascinating, he always mentions this, how much of this is baked into our notions of just how we speak. It's just so assumed that meaningfulness involves growth and development, right? So he then talks about like acrasia, which is a great term and certainly something I struggle with, and what a lot of my patients struggle with is knowing the right thing to do and yet ending up doing something else. And he would say that the reason that happens is that despite having the correct beliefs, you lack sufficient character. And that you need this virtual engine process of interacting with the environment, letting it change you, and then cultivating that character so that you become strong enough to then do the thing that is in accordance with your beliefs. And so then he asks, well, what is the highest development for a human, right? And he says, well, it is moving towards your potential, which for a human, and I'm going to skip a little bit through this, is in the interest of time, is becoming a rational being, right? And for him, a rational being, the purpose, the eidos of a human as a rational being is your capacity for overcoming self-deception, for cultivating character, realizing wisdom, enhancing the structure of the psyche and the contact with reality. And the purpose is to become as fully human as possible, the most human you can be in comparison to being an animal, a vegetable, or a mineral, inorganic, living mammalian, mental, and then finally human. And so moving through those stages of development, making yourself, seeking out conditions that promote your own self-organization, was a core aspect of being a living being and being a human, a rational being in his view. So again, super complex, tons to dive into. That's this is a longer summary to just to get through it is even complex, right?
It's a 20-minute long summary, and I totally sympathize.
Yeah.
We were supposed to do this episode last week or 2 weeks ago, and I think we both copped to saying, "Hey, I think we need some more time to digest this." This
yeah,
lecture.
I mean, I had to watch it again. And take notes.
I listened to it. Yeah, I listened to it 3 times. I took notes, all the time.
Yeah.
And I downloaded the transcript, and I had to read the transcript a bunch of times. I had to take a few walks and think about these concepts because he introduces so many different things. I wasn't aware that you didn't know about the sort of the idios being, what he describes it to be. I thought it was sort of commonplace knowledge, and it was just me who doesn't really study philosophy professionally, who didn't understand this is what idios was. But a very brilliant description of eidos and why it is profound to begin with. And you have to understand what Plato's definition of eidos was to understand what Aristotle's was, and if you don't, then this whole exercise is pointless and meaningless.
Yeah.
So I have a take here, and I'm curious to see what you think about this, because what I sort of think the entire episode was about was something he never actually brought up or mentioned explicitly. And what I thought it was really about creating a framework to push back against determinism and the absence of free will. And the reason I say that is because he, explains how Newtonian physics, was able to sort of explain things, and the fundamental premise of understanding the world through Newtonianism is that everything is causal. A causes B, causes C, causes D, and so on and so forth. And then you can put a miracle, you can call that God or the Big Bang in the beginning of that causality. But, once you assume the miracle, everything afterwards is just deterministic and causal. Correct. And this was sort of in conflict with the Aristotelian idea of how things come to be. Because according to Newtonianism, everything just sort of follows a series of causal patterns. And then when Kant saw the tree and he was very disturbed by the tree, he's like, well, I can't I can't really apply Newtonianism to the tree. Therefore, we cannot really have a philosophy of biology or a science of biology, right? And that was the sort of the dilemma that that other writer, Yararo, sort of tried to correct with the dynamical systems theory. But then, when he creates the idea of a virtual governor or a virtual engine, it takes him 20, 30 minutes to, create the building blocks to get to the virtual engine. But what he ends up doing is within this virtual engine is agency. Because if you are, creating a virtual engine that builds character, right? Implicit in that is the idea that you are making choices. You are self-constraining. So some of the selective constraints that you impose on your life in order to become fully human, those constraints are pulled out of free will and the imposition of freely chosen constraints. And that's sort of where the acresia idea comes from, is that is it acresia? Is that the word? Acresia?
Acresia, yes, I think I was. Yeah.
Acresia. So acresia occurs when you do not impose free will in your choices. That when you know what the right thing is, you have the wisdom to know you shouldn't eat the chocolate cake or the giant, donut or whatever it is. The wisdom is there, the knowledge is there. You can even perhaps say the wisdom is there, but the character isn't there. And the difference between a person having knowledge of things and acting on the knowledge, the difference between one and the other is simply the imposition of free will. through which character develops. And I wonder if you think that, that's entirely what this entire episode is about, is trying to dismantle Newtonian determinism and bring back a sort of Aristotelian free will development of character. Because if everything is Newtonian physics, then free will doesn't exist, and if free will doesn't exist, the notion of character doesn't exist, and you can even argue wisdom doesn't exist because you're not actually a free agent making any choices about anything. You're basically just being banged around like a pinball in a pinball machine, just
Sure.
by Newtonian physics. So what do you make of this? It's an overly simplistic boiling down of an hour-long brilliant lecture, but I sort of was puzzled by why he didn't himself raise the issue of this solves the problem of Newtonian determinism and the sort of erosion of the notion of free will.
So, I mean, I would agree with you that it provides a bit of a framework for that, right? Or that baked into the Aristotelian notion of character development is free will. You have to have free will in order to choose constraints, in order to choose to interact, to take action, right? And then the environment responds. Certainly, if you're talking to a materialist, pure Newtonian kind of person, they'll say, well, under all the biology is just physics. And so all of that is irrelevant, right? It is just at the electron level, things banging around, following physical law. And all of this is sort of a superficial, imperfect description that we assign to it just out of whatever, right? I mean, again, the language breaks down because even we assign what you would think would be a choice. And so these are some of my criticisms of materialism on some level, is that you can't even really speak materialist language in any reasonable way, because it's all the descriptions that we use in language imply choice. I don't know that a materialist would say that the problem is solved so much as he certainly asserts that everything we think about in terms of growth and development, our language, our way of being in the world, and trying to pursue a good life, trying to pursue wisdom, to avoid delusion, kind of in the axial revolution. He did say, we perform an axial revolution on ourselves, right? And I thought that was a really brilliant line, is that, we have to come out of delusion. We have to pursue wisdom. And these are descriptions of how to do that. But inherent to the axial revolution is the notion that we are not merely subject to the power of the gods, right? But we are actively co-creating the future with God. And that is an implication of agency. Inherent to the axial revolution concept is, whether that God is the God of physical law, and it's just the Big Bang playing itself out in the materialist view, or, some sort of Egyptian God that has more power over you, whatever it is, coming out of that delusion and into the notion that you have agency, you have responsibility for using that agency wisely to develop wisdom and to avoid the damage that comes out of living in delusion. That's the axial revolution, and we perform that both socially, externally, but we also perform it internally on ourselves to take control of our agency, and in Aristotle's terms, to use that to choose constraints that will create character over time as we act in the world in the context of those chosen constraints, right? And so I think the one of the huge additions here that's so brilliant is that, yes, we have free will. It gives some clarity to Plato's notion, or even our ideas that, well, our rationality, our willpower is quite limited in many ways, right? Is like we do eat the chocolate cake when we shouldn't. We do, whatever it is that we don't exercise when we know we should. All the things that go against our own beliefs, and yet we do it anyway. It is because of this lack of character, because willpower, free choice is not really that strong. But what you can choose is a set of constraints and virtues, that you act in the world in that context. And as you keep acting in the world with those constraints, over time you develop character, and then you are able to do the thing that your will or that your rational mind tells you should do, to act in accordance with your beliefs, right? But that is built over time. It's not a moment. It's not like, well, today, right now, I'm going to eat chocolate cake, or not eat the chocolate cake. Well, you're going to do it tomorrow, because you still didn't develop the character, right? You just made a one-time choice. Whereas when you set a set of constraints for yourself, I will not behave in these ways. I have these virtues. I have these aspects to my character: courage, forthrightness, discipline, whatever you want to call it, right? And you find the right ratio. Is courage doesn't become foolhardiness. Discipline doesn't become asceticism. There's a right balance that is created by having those constraints and acting in the world consistently over time in the context of those constraints, that you can develop your character. And so I think it just gives a direction on some level as to where we should be enacting our will. Where should we be, what should we be doing? And I think religions know that. Today is theoretically at least the last day of Ramadan, right? And so, I'm doing the fast and the whole thing. And one thought that kept occurring to me as I was listening to this lecture, right? There's a Gibran quote. He says, the highest king and the lowliest beggar are separated only by a day of hunger and an hour of thirst. And there's a genius to that, right? That at the end of the day, when you're thirsty, and we don't experience thirst in the U.S., right? You can go into any McDonald's and get a glass of water for free. Like and we take that so much for granted. But thirst is a demanding experience. But the religious idea of experiencing discipline is building character. It's not suffering for the sake of suffering, right? It is challenging difficulty to act in the world in the context of discipline. And the intention is to build character, to build the idea that I am able to act in accordance with my beliefs, not in accordance with my desires. And that is something that's cultivated that over time by, we do this with kids who teach them to fast. They do one fast when they're a kid, and then, and they're praised for it, and they whatever, right? And there's that social element to it, and the lion in the chest, and we kind of, all those aspects, right? But the cultivation of character, I think, is one of the intentions, at least, behind religious thought and religious practices, right? And I think that's why these older religions always have fasting as a part of it, right? Or giving charity, if you're cultivating generosity of character, right? Again, you can't do that in your mind. You can't just think about generosity or think about discipline or think about virtuousness, right? Like, these are disciplines, these are practices that, because if you don't set the constraint and then act in the world and fail and act and have the enabling constraint, but also the, don't go too far, the selective constraint, right? Be generous, but don't give all your money away, right? Like, all these things have limits. And so you have to find the right ratio, which is a process of experimentation. You have to go out in the world and make the mistake of giving too much and then end up short of money yourself and say, oh, shoot, I gave too much. Or then say, oh, I've given too little. I haven't practiced this building of my character, right? I need to go help someone out. It's even a part of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Is that a lot of them say that if you can get to the 12th step, you don't need the other steps, right? Or you've at least accomplished the other steps.
What is the 12th
is helping
step?
Another alcoholic.
I see.
Right? And that's kind of the interesting thing is the wisdom there is that in order to thrive, you must go give someone else the thing you need most. Right? And it's an interesting, again, but these are practices. You have to do it. All the alcoholics thing is, you have ask for forgiveness from those you have hurt, right? And it's only, they don't have to give it. You have to ask for it, though, right? And so these are practices, and all, Alcoholics Anonymous in some ways has a really deep spiritual basis, but religions all have this. AA has this, and these are Aristotelian notions of practicing in the world and building character over time to find the right ratio between the enabling constraint and the selective constraint of that virtual engine in each aspect of your character. And so, I think it is something that's built over time, and I think that's something we miss in our modern society. I'm just thinking of a patient I talked to who, is struggling to work out as much as he might like or whatever. And as we all do. But over time, if you continue doing it, you facilitate that enabling constraint, right? Then you will ultimately build the character to where you're able to do it consistently. It's just, and he's using resources. He's found a personal trainer and we all find gym buddies, or we find other people to hold us accountable. It's using that lion to engage the enabling constraint when we don't want to, right? And I think that wields it back to Plato, where, you can use that social impulse, the desire to look good naked, the desire for vanity, the desire for those things, and the accountability of having a gym buddy who's going to say, hey, where the hell were you? Like, I haven't seen you around, like whatever, to push you into that enabling constraint to move you in the direction of your wisdom, right? I don't know. Fascinating idea.
One of the ways to think about it as well is that, in the assertion of free will to make choices, to do things that you rationally understand as being virtuous and good, good for you or good for society, and those are your sort of selective constraints. Those are, you say, okay, I'm going to operate my life within the confines of these sort of parameters and boundaries, and these are boundaries that you've set for yourself, or religion sets for you, or society sets for you. But ideally, boundaries you set for yourself, because as a self-actualized, to use another Aristotelian notion, you also one of the ways in cultivating wisdom is to know what these constraints should be. Right? I mean, Vervaeke doesn't tell you what they are, but I don't think he's probably ever going to tell you, well, this is a good thing and this is a bad thing. But these are all things that you have to figure out as you're navigating yourself through life. But as you sort of navigate your life within these constraints and parameters, much like the tree causes sunlight to fall in a specific pattern, in the same way as you shape your life by the decisions that you make, every single day, you end up developing a structural, functional organization of a wise person, of a highly self-actualized person. So in a sense, the decisions that you make day to day that are rooted in wisdom, that occur because of the assertion of will, creates the ideos of a virtuous, wise person, right? So you could almost think of the eidos of a wise person as a dynamical system, right? Where decisions that you make every day, get you closer in touch with reality, and then the environment feeds back on itself, and then you do it again, but it's all done in sort of a constraint. One of the mental models I had for it was that it's almost like a mold within which concrete is poured over or clay is poured over, the mold being the eidos itself. Like, this is the structural, functional sort of receptacle that I want, my character to look like, or I want my life, I should say, my life to look like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the cement or the clay that you pour into it is the Newtonian engine that runs the universe, right? And that's sort of the determinism. So the laws of nature, which are Newtonian, is what causes the concrete to assume the shape. But the shape is something that is determined by yourself through the assertion of free will. And that's kind of where he divides the sort of Newtonianism and the Aristotelianism, is that the Newtonianism is the causes and the events, that this is the engine of how sort of, to use a computer term, and I wrote this down as well, Newtonianism is the compute. And
no, that's funny. I was just about to go there.
Newtonianism is the compute, and Aristotelianism is the eidos, or the software that the compute runs. Newtonianism is completely agnostic and blind to what it will run. It will run, Hitler's source code, and it will run the Dalai Lama's source code, right? It will run whatever source codes it's given. It's the compute environment. But what is being computed is the eidos, right? And we have agency there. So this is the neat sort of philosophical trick that he does over here, is that, yes, Newtonianism, bereft of free will, totally mechanistic, but what software it runs, that is not mechanistic. That is an act of will. It's an act of personality. It's an act of, not personality, it's an act of character.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah.
And that the way that your life is molded is rooted in decisions and in free will. So that's one way
I would take that I would take that analogy a little bit even further. I think both combining almost the tree and the compute semantic there. I don't know if you've ever played around with any of these fractal generators. So you just look up online, Google like tree fractal generator or whatever. Pretty simple software, right? Like it'll draw a line, and then like a branch or something at an angle, or two branches, right? And basically then when you hit go, it will replicate exactly what you've drawn using each segment as its own trunk. So you start with a trunk and then you draw something, and it will replicate that using each segment as its own trunk, and it rapidly produces a tree. Like it looks very much like a tree within 10 or 20 iterations, right? And so the point is that you can get all of the complexity of a tree or our blood vessel vascular system, right? Not by having a complex description of each branch and leaf, but simply an iterated law, right? Is that replicate this at 1/3 the size at the tip of each thing. Very simple code, iterated repeatedly over time, builds complexity, right? Builds richness. And then you add certain things to it, is that like, if you get more photons here, increase rate of growth by 1/3, right? And then a very small addition to the code there, but again, iterated over time, the plant will grow towards the sun, right? And so the notion here is that you as have the free will as an agent to set your constraints, just like you said, right? But those constraints, by acting in the world, then start to act upon you and define your structure.
They change you.
They change you, right? You act in the world with these constraints, with these ethics, these virtues, these boundaries. That in itself, iteratively over time, builds a self. It builds a character, right? And
it builds
it's
a life, right? It
builds a life, right?
Right.
Yeah, and by interacting with the environment in that way, in that context, then things are built progressively over time, just like a tree grows, right? And it grows toward the light. It grows upward because it is in the enabling constraint is to grow toward more photons, right? If more photons happen, then increase the growth rate, right? I think it also connects to kind of Jung's idea of individuation, is that becoming, it ties directly into Plato's idea. Is Jung felt that your especially the early part of your life, should be spent becoming an individual, meaning becoming the most you that you can be, right? And so I should become the most Zane-like Zane that I can be, and that is the work of at least the early part of my life, right? And that is the form, the eidos of Zaneness, right? So not even Jung took that basically just one step further. Is it's not just becoming the most human you can be, but becoming the most you that you can be, right? Is that there is the collective unconscious of humanity, and that's a part of you, but then there's also something that's uniquely you, and that the constraints and boundaries of your variant, your individual variant of humanity, should also be a part of your potential and growing towards that. So yeah, I think taking a step back, I think the eidos there of yourself is the code you choose to run in the world. What are my boundaries? What are my limits? What will I and will I not do, right? And how do I meet challenges? How do I behave? How do I think? How do I respond to setbacks? How do I, all of these things are constraints on all the possible ways you could act, right? You could do all kinds of things. You could walk around punching people in the face. You can walk around, talking to yourself, hallucinating, totally out of touch with reality. You can walk around totally focused on your own feelings, not caring about what anybody else is doing, right? And you would be mad. You would be a crazy person, right? And we see that actually. In the mentally ill there's a deep disconnect from reality, right? But in order to connect to reality, you have to set constraints on your behavior and act in the world in the context of those constraints consistently over time. And that sets the generative engine at work, right? That is what kind of, because you can't keep changing the rules either, right? Like if 1 minute you have one constraint and then another minute you have another constraint, then
you have no constraints at all.
Yeah. I mean, or the end, the engine only ever gets one cycle, right? And then you change the engine, right? Yeah. You're never running the engine; it's never moving you forward, right? Yeah. It just and so it's almost better in some way to have imperfect constraints than to have no constraints, because at least certainly at some point you may find that your constraints are not serving you, and you may have to redo the engine. Right?
I mean, there's also this notion of you have the entirely wrong constraints, right? You could just choose to be evil, right? You
totally.
just choose to internalize beliefs that are ultimately highly destructive, right? So for all of his faults, Hitler was a charismatic, disciplined person, right? And he was able to effect change in the world. Sure. I would argue, hot take here.
Yes.
A hot take here is that I don't personally think that his ideology was very virtuous. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, yes, just your opinion. I understand.
Yes. Daring, daring little opinion positively there. But
you're a really original thinker. I don't know it's pretty out of the box there, man. The idea that Hitler is perhaps not the most virtuous person. It's taking a leap
in unexpected ways. But it highlights the importance of one of the things he glossed over a little bit. Where he says, well, Aristotle had this idea of the mean. What was the word he did?
Golden mean.
The golden mean, that's right. So what constraints you decide on, right? I mean, we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about pick an engine, stick to the engine. If you keep running the engine over time, it will change you because as you run the engine, you engage with the environment, and the environment feeds back on you. And as a result, this iterative change forms an eidos of your life. Yep. But that eidos of your life could be a horrific outcome, as it could be the Hitler-like eidos as well. And something he glossed over is choosing the constraints wisely, right? And he sort of says, well, the golden mean is one example of how, courage versus being foolhardy. But, what in your view, and this is a much harder question, is how do you go about selecting the constraints? In other words, how do you pick a direction? It's one thing to know these things, like I need a direction. And once I have a direction, I need to move in it, and I need to do that in a consistent way. I need to consistently be making these choices. I may falter, but the engine has to be started up again, and I have to just keep at it, right? So it's okay to, like, fall. It's okay when the engine stalls. But the idea is that you start the engine back up. You keep cycling the engine. You keep getting back on it. But one of the things he doesn't discuss, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this, is what should be, I should say, or how do you go about selecting the selective constraints?
Yeah, so I think in that regard, what occurs to me is you have to understand Aristotle in the context of what we've talked about the last two times, in the context of the axial revolution, in the context of Socrates, and in the context of Plato. But especially the axial revolution and Socrates, right, is that Socrates very much felt that one of the core aspects was connection to the truth, right? Not just relevancy, not just our emotional attachment to whatever feeling we get that again Plato would describe as the monster, right? But really getting into the truth of things, and I think that's where I think we don't have to go as far as Hitler. Like you can see that in the world today, where part of what the struggle is, no one wants to be nuanced. So much of our political speech is, or even scientific speech in the wellness sphere and stuff like that, is just based on high-sounding, vague, big statements that are based on hijacking relevancy, right? Not nuanced explanations of the truth. And so I think there's a deeper answer here that I'll get to, but staying superficial for a moment, if you are trying to move toward a good life, you have to be very careful to tune into the truth, not just be governed by the appetite, by the emotions, right? And that was Socrates' kind of point in a lot of ways, is that if you are responsible for co-creating the future with God, be careful what future you create, right? And be attentive to the consequences, the long-term consequences of your actions, right? Not to create, not to create a delusion just because it gives you a sense of power, just because it feel good, right? To have other people follow you because you're convincing, because you're charismatic, because you're whatever, right? But instead to pay very close attention to the truth and be nuanced and careful, because you have to be careful what world you create. So I think that's one protection that Socrates would point out. I think in many ways also Aristotle and Kant after him focused on the notion of developing your character, and Jung after them as well, that developing yourself should be the goal, right? It shouldn't necessarily be achieving a place in society, right? Or achieving the development of character and virtue, different virtues, right? Now, that gets to the deeper answer, is what things are virtuous and which things are not, right? And that's, that is what Kant was trying to work out, right? Is what is the good? Socrates too, actually. What is the good? How do we know what is good and what is not? And so there's depth there. I think there is a depth of challenge there. I don't know that there's any final answer. I'm partial to Kant's answer in many ways. He formulates I think it's the six expressions of the universal law of morality, kind of. So you should only act in such a way that he called it maxim. You might call it the principle or the guiding principle or the intention or the software. You should only act in such a way that the maxim of your action could be universal, right? So if I make a promise knowing that I will break the promise, I make a deceiving promise, right? Well, he says, if you play that out, and if everyone did that, it would destroy the notion of promising. A promise would no longer mean anything, right? And because it becomes self-referentially contradictory, you could it is the principle of making a deceiving promise is immoral because it leads to the destruction of its own entity. Right?
I see.
And so,
interesting how that was not that. I thought where that was going was that it would destabilize society in some fundamental way.
yeah, so
No one
Kant
could
is
trust
interesting
each
because
other.
he ignores consequence. It's not that it's a bad thing, it's that it's self-contradictory.
Interesting.
Right? So he does, because otherwise you would have a pre-existing notion of good. It would be circular.
Yeah.
Why is having a society without promises bad? You're self-referential.
Yeah,
But
doesn't mean
by
anything.
appealing to logical self-contradiction, he kind of escapes that trap. And there are issues with that. So we can get into the criticisms of Kant, whatever, that's a long discussion. But the other one, I thought, the other expression of the universal law, and he claims that these are 6 expressions of a single law, which is interesting in itself. But the other one I'll just touch on is that you cannot treat any other moral agent merely as an ends to a means. You must always treat them as an end in themselves. Right? So I cannot just use you for my own purposes without considering your benefit. Right? So if you go to McDonald's and you order a hamburger, right, it would be immoral to do that if the person were not getting paid, because they are not being treated as an end in themselves, merely as a means to get your hamburger, right? So it's kind of you end up with issues with slavery through that notion, is that like, well, in what way does this benefit this other moral entity, right? So anyway, I don't want to get too far into Kant. Those are just 2 of the 6, but there are notions of trying to figure out what is good. What is the software you could run to try to determine what is good? But then you can't apply that every day. Every day you can't be saying, well, what is the principle of my action? Could I generalize this? Do I end up in a contradiction, right? You have to at some point say, well, from that, I can get the notion that honesty and consistency, keeping promises, being trustworthy, these are virtues. And then you end up in an Aristotelian world where now you've defined a virtue. That's an enabling constraint. An excess of virtue is itself harm. And so you have to put a selector constraint on the same thing, right? And so, yes, I need to treat this person as a means, but if I go around only treating people as a means, I'll never accomplish my own ends.
So
right?
would a dumbed down version, because, I'm all about trying to come up with some recipe, actionable sort of bullet points, would it be to identify what is virtuous, right? Actions or perspectives that are virtuous, and then sort of just live a life that are in concordance with those virtuous principles. And by doing so, you will, you will create self, constraints, keep the engine running, and that will in turn iteratively, affect your life as well. So I mean, you mentioned honesty. So for example, if we have identified that honesty is a virtue, then you must act honestly at all times. And any times that you are not being honest, you are, weak-willed. What is the word? I keep forgetting. Acasia?
Acrasia. Yeah.
You are, committing an act of acrasia where you know what the right thing to do is, and yet you don't do it. You are not engaging in virtue. But,
but again, remember the concept of the golden mean there, right? So it's a little more nuanced than that. Yes, there is the virtue, but there is also the excess of virtue, right? That virtue taken too far. And I think that's a nuanced idea Aristotle has, is that any virtue can be taken too far, even honesty, right? And so, yes, you should be honest, but in the correct ratio, right?
So you should tell your significant other that she looks great in that dress?
Yeah, absolutely, right? Yeah, no, totally, right? And it is that idea is that
debatable.
Even honesty has to have selection limits, right? There has to be a virtual governor in the system as well.
Yeah, and I don't know that I agree with that, first of all, but just you saying that highlights the idea of the challenge of identifying what is virtue, right? So first of all,
Sure.
what is virtue? And then you're saying, well, not only what is virtue, but then there's a spectrum of how much virtue you should have of that virtue in your life, right? There could be
Correct.
too much thing as honesty. There can be too much thing as hardworking. There can be too much thing as loving somebody or something, all of which are on the face obvious. But what makes it difficult to turn into action is to assess for yourself, well, how much honesty is being too honest, right? When should you hold your tongue and at least not be dishonest, but at least not go around spewing honesty all over the place, just have a diarrhea of honesty every time you see somebody. I'm like, I don't like you very much. I was never honest to you about it before, but I'm going to tell you now, right? That sort of thing. So it makes it difficult. Again, what I was asking you before is, how do you set up the constraints? How do you decide that, okay, these are my limiters, right? These are my selective conditions.
I don't know. I mean, I have no. I mean, I don't know a general. It's interesting to think through. Take honesty for instance, right? I think one of the aspects of honesty is that we regulate the degree of honesty to the degree of intimacy that we have, right? Like, if you're doing something that I think is wrong, I'm more likely to be like, "Hey, dude, I think you're fucking up," than if the barista at the coffee shop is doing that same thing. Like, if they're fucking up their life, if you start doing crack, I'm going to be like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, absolutely not. Right. Whereas if he's doing crack, I'm like, yeah, dude, live your life. Don't drive. Don't affect me. Right. As long as it doesn't affect me, it's not my, and that's kind of one of those things. Right. And so, I think that's part of how we limit it functionally. I don't know if that's how we should limit it. Right. There's certainly an argument to be made but we have limited amounts of time and energy and attention. And so, I think that we do have to limit our honesty to some degree to intimacy. But what is the principle behind that, right? Because, I don't know if is that generally the case? Is that all of our virtues are more applicable to our closer circle? Is that the correct limiter? And it fades out as we exit kind of other circles? Like, it kind of seems to be true functionally, but I don't know. I mean, and mind you, I'm relying there on that. What is that number? The Dunbar's number, right?
Dunbar's
where
150.
Where you can only have so many people in your inner circle, and your next circle and it's always by a factor of 3, roughly. So if you have 5 people in your inner circle, you can have 15 friends. You can have 45, 50 sort of acquaintances, and then 150 people in your tribe, sort of roughly, right? And those numbers vary depending on how introverted or extroverted you are, but it's roughly in a factor of 3. And it'd be interesting. I mean, I think off the cuff, I wonder if that's kind of how our virtues are limited, right? You only have time and attention for 3 to 5 people in your inner circle and 9 people in your friend circle. So,
my question goes a little bit further than that. I mean, not only like how do you know what is virtuous, and your answers to these questions were interestingly focused on how to treat other people, but I was actually really asking about, how do you apply these principles to give direction to your life in a virtuous way? How do you live your life so that it is moving in a certain direction? Because at the end of the day, I think Vervaeke's lecture, he was saying that Aristotle's views of wisdom was to be as most human as possible. And maybe part of that is the way that you treat others, sure.
Yeah,
but part of that also is what is the pattern or the eidos of your own life look like? And in some sense, I mean, what is the story of your life? What have you done with this life that you've been given? Whether that you started a successful family or a business or a career, or you created ideas and you put those in the world, you created art, whatever that is. How do you employ these principles to come up with an answer to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I have a very functional idea of that. I don't know that I have as much of a philosophical understanding, but I can talk about the functional understanding, because that's RiverRock at the end of the day. That's what I'm doing, actually, right? Is the notion, I think, is that we do have individual natures. This is more of a Jungian idea, right? That we're not all just human. We're variants on humanity, right? And we do have certain personality traits. We do have certain preferences. We do have certain tastes, right? And that is, to some degree, us as an individual. And growing within those is part of the expression. So, I mean, we don't really, it's unclear that we completely choose our favorite subjects in school, right? It may come down to which teacher we have. It may come down to just baseline preference. It may just come down to taste, right? But there's something that, why are you more interested in one topic than another, right? Some people are really into, I don't know, guns, right? And other people are really into painting. And why? Like, well, it's sort of just something in you connects with the universe at that point. It fits rightly with the universe. There's a sense of clicking into place when you engage with that topic, right? And so functionally, I think becoming the most you that you can be is figuring out what those things are and then building the habit of enhancing those, right? So I think that's a big part of it. The second part of it, though, is figuring out what your traits are, what your tendencies are as a character, and almost the opposite is learning to do the opposite. If you're a huge introvert, then developing character as a trait development is learning to be extroverted when the occasion calls for it. If you are a super open, flowy artist person, learning to constrain yourself and make choices and stick to them and say, this is what I'm doing, this is where I'm going, that is character development as well, right? If you're super organized and orderly and you need everything lined up, learning to tolerate a little bit of messiness is going to be a really good thing, right? Overcoming your OCD tendencies, right? And so I think those two aspects of growth within the context of ethics, maybe, right? Within the context of good social behavior. To me, I think on a functional level, I think those three things, ethics, how you treat other people, your character, meaning, or traits, your personality traits, learning to grow beyond your default mode. And number three, pursuing and enhancing the ways you fit rightly with the universe. Those are the three sort of aspects of character development that I'm aware of. And so I don't know what the philosophy is underneath those, but I observe that practically, I think, as a very practical way of saying, how do I figure out what the direction of my life should be? It's those three topics, I would say.
Yeah, that's that's a start, I guess. This lecture of Vervaeke's does not really offer those tools. It just sort of sets up the idea of the virtual engine that, if you do move your life in a certain direction, you are basically writing your IDOS in a certain sense, right?
Yes.
In a certain sense, you are self-organizing the IDOS yourself.
Yep.
And I think that was the big idea out of this lecture. He doesn't actually then put into that idea the code that should, how
do you choose what IDOS you should write?
Yeah.
Yep.
And that might be outside of the scope of his work. We haven't gone through all 50 lectures yet, my instinct is that he will probably not give prescriptive solutions, but he will at least show you the framework, like, well, this is how to think about it, what you put in there, what machinery, what the engine looks like, whether it's this kind of engine or that kind of engine, is up to the individual probably to make. Well, one of the things that I will say, though, the way, the meaning making, or the way in which to construct the engine that you described is all well and good. But one of the things that I've really been drawn to is Jordan Peterson's answers to one of those questions. Is his simple prescription is carry a load, take on some responsibility, do something in your life where others are dependent on you, and that in itself, that sort of selective constraint, if we were to put it that way. The constraint of just having responsibility, just saying I'm going to be responsible for something. That might just be you're raising a cat or a dog, but now the cat or a dog is responsible for you showing up and feeding it. Or it could be you have a certain job that has a lot of responsibility, or whatever it is. But lifting a load.
So I agree with that, but I think that's an enhancement of Vervaeke's point, in the sense that is the notion of engaging the engine, right? Is to create those constraints on yourself to say, hey, I am responsible for keeping this dog alive. I'm responsible for fulfilling this job. I'm responsible for, whatever it is, being a good friend, a good, husband, a good whatever, right? But which things should you pick? It doesn't answer that question, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm trying to do in my work at RiverRock, is help people pick which things they should be responsible for. And yes, the answer is to take responsibility in order to get that generative engine going, right? Once you pick, say, hey, okay, I really find, physical development really meaningful. Okay, well then you need to make it a responsibility to yourself and maybe to someone else.
In your patients, then how do you get them to identify what is the thing that they find meaningful? Because that's not obvious to most people either.
No, yeah. So a couple of ways. So one is I start by asking a couple of open-ended questions, and I'm still working on these, so it's a method in development, to be totally fair. But one is, hey, so if you gained $10 million more than you have, right? Or if you gained enough money that you never had to think about money again, what would you do to still feel engaged with your life and wake up in the morning and be excited, right? If you had no necessities to worry about. And that's not an academic question for a lot of my patients. A lot of my patients are quite wealthy, and so that's one thing. The other way of framing that question is, let's say you're 40 years old, right? And you say, okay, hey, you're age 40, you've accomplished these things, you've become a doctor, you've become whatever. That's great. So you've really kind of done some cool stuff up to this point. Imagine you are on your deathbed now at age 150, right? What did you do between now and then where you're looking back and you say, man, I really killed it. I was really a success. I did what I needed to do to really feel like I made the most of my life. What did you do, right? If you put yourself in that shoes, who is around you on your deathbed, right? So those are kind of some of the questions that I start to ask. And then sometimes people don't even know that. And you can ask, okay, cool. Well, what experiences have you had where you really felt like you were fulfilled and you were willing to tolerate suffering or difficulty in order to do it? Right? The willingness, because that's an interesting, we've talked at various points, is if you find yourself pursuing a path that is inherently uncomfortable, it's because you find something meaningful in it, right? Mm-hmm. So I ask, what times have you overcome difficulty? What times have you pushed through, hard times and suffering, and why? Why did you not give up? Why did you not kill yourself? Why did you not get addicted to drugs or narcotics? Why did you push through, right? And you can start to pull out the answers that way. If all of that fails, I've had enough of these conversations that I feel like I've identified 7 or 8 common categories of things. So intimacy, which is deep connection, seeing and being seen, being your true self and being witnessed. Family, which is the notion of closeness and belonging to people who are deeply meaningful to you. Community, which is belonging to a group that you have some ideological connection to. Pursue or collecting beautiful experiences. Self-expression, like if you're an artist, you're just driven to express your soul in some way. I lump building, making, discovery, and exploration into a single group, right? These are scientists, carpenters, people that feel compelled to make things.
So these are more functional models of meaning making.
They're categories of things that humans seem to resonate with, right? Status is another one for its own sake. Just competitiveness is some people are really driven by just the notion of status. I'm missing one, I think. But my point is that these categories, what's interesting is when you start, pursuing your ideal vision of yourself, or making progress towards your ideal vision of yourself, is the last category. So those 8 things are the categories I've identified so far of things humans find meaningful, right? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is I've had these conversations over and over with patients is that when I say the ones that are theirs, the energy changes in the room immediately, right? If I say, oh, hey, community, that's like, kind of really belonging to your football team or your church or your, whatever, your knitting group or your whatever, if you say that to me, I just don't care, right? I'm completely flat.
So are you
on
saying
that.
you don't have a knitting group that gives you meaning and purpose in life?
I do, but that's just a dating pool. It's actually not about the knitting and community at all. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I don't, right? I'm not really resonant on the notion of community. But if you say progress towards your ideal self, boom, immediately I'm like, yes. If you say building, discovering, making, yes, absolutely, right? If you say, intimacy, yes, absolutely, I'm immediately there. And so out of those 8, I think generally people resonate with between 3 and 5 of those, right? And then I force them to choose a hierarchy, is what is the order of importance here, right? And out of the ones you find interesting, I mean, you have to figure out how much time you're going to spend. If you're talking about pursuing, unless you get lucky and you have a job that allows you to pursue multiple things, right? And it, if you have a job that is both community focused and helps you build and discover, right? Then great, you're getting 2 for 1. If you have a relationship with a spouse, for instance, you get family and intimacy. You can kind of do both of those in the same environment, right? But unless you overlap, pursuing 5 things is like a 100-hour work week. Like, it's a lot of work you have to spend if you're really pursuing character development on multiple things, right? And then for traits, just to flesh out the theory here, for traits, I think I use the big 5 for the most part. I also use the Enneagram to some degree, but introversion, extroversion, et cetera, those are traits that you could pursue growth. Those are areas you could pursue character in. And then for values and ethics, I think I'm kind of excited. I've a little bit fleshed out a framework there. I think number 1 is understanding what it is to be trustworthy. What are the elements of trustworthiness, right? Is consistency, predictability in some sense. People know, and that's again, he says virtue is having that engine run over time in the world, behaving in that way. It creates trustworthiness. Is I know who you are because I've seen you act consistently in certain ways over time, right? So consistency, independence, meaning you're not influenced by someone else. I'm actually talking to you. If I'm talking to you and you're a rich person's kid whose entire lifestyle is paid for by mom, well, you're actually on some level just a mouthpiece for mom, because if you want to do something and mom says no, she has ultimate say, right? So I can't trust you. I can't trust any of the decisions you make because there's always the opportunity for it to be overridden, right? So anyway, I don't want to go too far into that, but I've delineated aspects of trustworthiness, which I think is one really key element of ethics. The interesting thing is then you take all the elements of trustworthiness, consistency, independence, honesty, et cetera, and then you say, well, if you treat your own deepest self, your own unconscious, if you will, your own eidos, right? Are you trustworthy to that eidos? Have you treated that eidos in a way where it should trust you and you've consistently pursued it and acted in its own best interest over time? Jordan Peterson said that, treat yourself like a person you're responsible for helping, right? But this is kind of a deepening of that, or a doubling down on that idea, is if your own ideal self or your own eidos in this term were a person, would that person trust you? Have you acted consistently in such a way that that person would trust you, right? And then the last element is in terms of your interactions with others, I think in each relationship you have, determining what the line is between generosity and obligation. And if you can figure out where the line is between generosity and obligation, you've defined sort of the correct boundary for that. And you can do that again by asking the question, if a friend came to me talking about another one of their friends or their mom or their spouse and said, hey, I'm going to act in this way toward my spouse, I'm going to cheat on them, or I'm going to treat them in this way or whatever, how would you judge that behavior? Would you feel that was appropriate, right? Given everything you know about the circumstance, would you, because there may be some circumstance in which you feel like cheating would be appropriate, right? Or there may be some circumstance in which you feel like divorce would be appropriate, right? And so you can judge it by third partying it a little bit and saying, okay, this is the line that you're obligated to act in this way. You shouldn't cheat. You should just get divorced, right? You shouldn't. This is the line between obligation and generosity. You owe them this, but you don't owe them that, right? And so if you can draw that line by thinking about each relationship in third party, I think that's the last expression of sort of values and boundaries. And so each of those areas is an area of growth. I really don't think we have time in life to pursue more than 3 to 5 of those on any given week, right? And so, yeah, those are the generative engines that you can try to start rolling, and you should shift. Like, if you spend time building your virtue, building your values, then at some point you've built it enough and you need to go build a life that's meaningful and pursue, painting or self-expression or pursuing your ideal self or whatever that is, and say, okay, I've built my virtue enough. I understand my line between obligation and generosity enough for the moment. It's not perfectly defined, but it's enough for the moment. I'm not going to be actively working on it, right? I've overcome my introversion enough for practical purposes. I'm going to shift. And you pick a different 5, right? And those are often epochs in life. We notice when we shift. We notice when we say, okay, hey, actually, I'm going to shift over to paying attention to this other thing now. Hey, I've built with my patients, it's all, I've built my empire. I've got my $1 million, whatever, and now I want to build a family. I'm shifting my focus, right?
Yeah.
And we notice. So on a very practical, I don't have a philosophy behind that, but on a very practical level, I think those are the things that you can start these generative engines on and start setting what are the enabling constraints, what are the, and figuring out what the selective constraints should be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Bringing it back a little bit to a philosophy just a little bit here, one of the, I think, takeaways that I got out of it, internalizing it for my own purposes, is that every time you make a free will conscious decision to move upwards, sort of, with the sort of virtual engine, you are sort of putting a coin in the piggy bank of your eidos, right? The eidos is firming up, and you are getting closer to sort of the self-actualization. Again, these are words that we take for granted now, but not realizing it until this lecture that this was an Aristotelian idea.
I mean, that's Maslow, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that we the way towards self-actualization is to just sort of keep staying true to the ideals that you want your life to be, right? You can have a vision of what your ideas is. You are a strong man or woman, and you are trustworthy and you are accomplished in these ways. Or it could be something else. It could be that, you have you're a loving parent, and a member of a community, small village, whatever it is, right? But that is the vision that you have of what your eidos is. Then every time you make a decision in life, whether it's not eating the chocolate cake and going for a run instead, whether it's choosing to be kind when you didn't want to be kind, or even whether it's choosing to show anger when it's appropriate to show anger, but making these conscious choices in service of your ideas. So in a very intentional way, you're acting in certain ways that are consistent with your eidos. Every time you make that decision, the eidos gets more firm and more real, right? It becomes
Yes.
more self-actualized.
Yes.
And
You're moving from
over
potential to reality. Yep.
yeah, exactly right. You're moving from potentiality to actuality.
Yep.
And every step, every time you do that, it's an iterative process where you set up your sort of boundaries, then you keep sticking to them, you keep the engine going, and as he says, the environment changes you, and then you turn around one day and you are literally the embodiment of your ideal idos, right? But
And
the trick is to be making these intentional decisions every day, to keep the engine,
Yes.
to use your metaphor, to keep the engine running, even if it stalls, right? It's
Yes.
the engine is stalled. I ate the chocolate cake today. I
Yep.
stalled the
Yep.
engine, right? That's fine. Tomorrow's another day. Rev the
Tomorrow's
engine
another
back
day.
up, right?
Yep.
But just keep getting the engine going, right? Even when it
Yes.
stalls. So that's sort of
Yes.
the practical sort of mind experiment, that whenever I eat a
Yep.
chocolate cake, I just tell myself, okay, engine stalled.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great model. Yeah, you just got to crank it back up again. And there's always, I like this model, right? Because there's starting friction, right? It's like, okay, once the engine's running, it's a little easier to keep it running.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
But
that's
if
true.
it stalls out and you make the wrong decision, you got to crank it a little bit. And it takes a little bit more effort to turn the crank to get the engine running again, right?
That's right.
And so, if you keep stalling out, that can be frustrating. But the only solution is just keep turning that crank, right?
What else are you going to do, right? Are you going to be a
what else
plant?
are you going to do? No, I mean, I love his language there is like, if you were a human acting as a plant and just digesting and, whatever, you would be a debauched sort of, shell of a human. You would not be living up to your potential, right? But in order to live up to your potential, you have to turn that engine. You have to have the constraints set in your mind, and then you have to every day kind of crank that engine until it starts running on its own. And I think that it does, right? Over time, it becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. Once once the tree grows to a certain size, it sort of is the tree, and it no longer is trying to become the tree. It has become the tree. And as you said, I really liked your language earlier, is that then you are a wise man, right? You are acting in the world. So at first you're trying to achieve wisdom, but then you just are wise at some point, right? Now you may never feel that. Ideally, I think that would be a part of wisdom, but you would be, even at the moments where you weren't thinking about it, you would be acting in wise ways.
Yeah. Others at least would see you as a wise person, even if, like Socrates, you didn't think you were.
Sure.
And that's probably the better way to be. But I mean, it could be that, you are a trustworthy, maybe that's a better metric to use, is, if you hold yourself accountable to keeping your promises and you keep that engine going, even though sometimes, hopefully seldom, it stalls, but you keep promises that are even difficult to keep, then over time you are known as a person who is trustworthy. Right.
And I think there's so many aspects to that, because I think, in my life, certainly, there have been times where I lied, or I deceived someone, or called in sick when I wasn't sick, or whatever the thing was. Right. And, making the choice to not do that comes at a cost. There is whatever I failed a test and you had to own up to it to your parents instead of hiding it, or whatever the deal is, right? You have to take your lumps in some sense, right? Or you screwed up a project at work and, whatever, and you killed a patient, and you have to say, you know what, I fucked up, and not displace the blame onto anyone else, not, kind of try to avoid that. But when you do that consistently over time, what you learn is that you are strong enough to take those lumps, and it becomes easier to take those lumps when it happens, right? Because the engine has, you avoided stalling the engine, and the engine's got a little momentum now. And so being an honest person now is a little bit easier. Each time you show yourself that actually, no, I can tell the truth and bear the consequences of telling the truth, and I'm strong enough to bear the consequences of telling the truth. And so then it's a little easier to tell the truth the next time, and easier and easier and easier. And that sense of ease is you becoming an honest person. It's internalizing, it's actualizing that character, right? And once it is actualized, then it's easier because you're not becoming, you are.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said. All right, man. This is a great
Cool.
talk on top
Yeah,
of a great
absolutely.
lecture. Looking forward to the next one. And the one after that, which is about the Buddha, which I am very excited to listen to since you're not a big
Yeah.
fan of Buddhism.
Yeah, no,
But
I have
at
a
least
feeling he may
Buddhist.
change my mind. Again, with this, my view of Plato was completely different. Maybe my view of Buddha is completely
Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
right? I'm excited to.
Like my favorite part of this entire lecture, which like completely encapsulates why I love this guy so much, is when he demonstrated, watch my language here, he's not
Yes.
living up to his potential, and it just all clicked together. I'm like,
Yeah.
our grammar is so deeply interwoven, but we
Yes.
don't know where it comes from. And I think, like he said in the lecture, part of the work of going through all of this is to revive the profundity of some of these statements, right?
Sure.
Like one of the things he says is that if I hadn't said all of this other stuff for the last 40 minutes, this next statement would sound very trite, which is Aristotle says that our goal in life is to be as fully human as possible. Now that sounds incredibly trite if you don't know what the context is, right?
Yeah.
But and into this part of the work he's doing is reviving these ancient philosophies and showing us why they are so highly relevant in a way that I'm actually kind of mad hasn't already been done, like the Plato's form idea. I told you I started reading philosophy a bit seriously a few years ago, and I've read this forms idea because I get like very agitated when I don't get it. I'm like, surely this idea of forms must be more important and profound than I'm understanding.
It wouldn't have survived this long if it, right?
Exactly. That was my bias. I'm like, why are we talking about this 2,500 years later? This seems like a really stupid idea. And it was only because all these philosophy texts, even Bertrand Russell, for example, I told you this, criticized the idea of forms. He says, well, what Plato did not think about is that a triangle has 3 straight lines. So therefore, there's 3 iterations of a straight line that makes this other thing called a triangle. Therefore, the idea of forms just seems to be nonsensical. I'm like, and obviously even Bertrand Russell did not really understand what the idea of forms really meant. And here we are, like explained beautifully in a lecture that ties it into what it's really about, right? Which is how to live a good life, right? Which is really what philosophy should be about, right? And so I'm really happy that this is, for me at least, also an education in philosophy, in useful philosophy, as opposed to, sort of, epistemological dark hole, black or dark holes or rabbit holes, I should say. About, how do we know what is really real? I'm like, that's fine, but this other stuff is way more interesting. How to live a good life or how to live a fulfilling life, right? And
no, I totally agree. I think the way
there.
of pulling that back, and even you talked about the idea of growing up, right? That he said, like, listen to the language, like growing up. I recently had this conversation actually. That
living up.
Why? What's that?
Living up to your potential.
Living up to your potential. Correct. But why is it that God is in the sky and hell is beneath us, right? Why is one up and one down, right? And consistently because we stand up, plants grow up, right? And we use up, and when we die, we lay down on the ground, and so the notion of like life being upward and death being, or goodness being upward and death and badness being downward is just sort of baked into just sort of the experience of even a pre-verbal human, right? Like, before written language, we would have those biases, right? Up good, down bad is right. Sort of just, almost all around us, right? And so we would kill things and then bury them. Just that those notions were baked very deeply already, right? And so the metaphor of living up to your potential, that a tree grows up into its potential, right? There is space, there is potentiality in the space above us, right? Whereas the ground is, there's no space below us, right? It's solid. And so that notion of solidity and space and growth upward and all of those things, but we do speak of being rooted, right? We speak of being firm, keeping your feet on the ground, right? Those are also notions that it's like, okay, you have to have a base. You can't be growing into nothing, right? From nothing into nothing, right? We're not an air plant sort of just hanging out in space, right? And so, I think all of these notions in language, he points out really well. Project, object, subject, the notion of throwing and ejection, right? Biject,
Even
all of these are...
understanding, right? Understanding.
Yeah, correct. To stand under. Yeah, exactly.
Or, actually,
Brilliant.
I forgot to mention this. My favorite of all of them was information.
Yes.
That was like the best.
That was so good. Yeah, totally. Totally.
It
right?
completely demonstrates the idea of eidos, right? That it is the embodied
correct.
data almost, right? The data,
Yep.
like he even says that it's actually difficult to describe the eidos of a thing, right? It's almost like we have an intuitive understanding. We were supposed to close this podcast off already.
There's too much. There's too much to talk about.
There's too much to talk about. This is an incredibly rich lecture.
Yeah. Totally.
I sort of thought of it. It didn't quite work, but the analogy I wanted to shoehorn into this was that, eidos could be like the data that's encoded of a thing in the matrix simulation that we all live in, right? But it doesn't quite work, right? Because that data has to be based on something, right? So it's the almost homunculus man fallacy is like, well, there's another thing that references this thing, so where does that thing reference, right? So
I will say, and I've made this argument to you before, I think there is something that's interesting there, is that the part of the reason that gestalt, that eidos, is difficult to describe is because it is a human projection, right? That we project that eidos out into the world and onto ourselves in some sense as an act of free will. If I've made this example before, is if I see a cup on the table, well, why are they separate things, right? Like if for some bizarre reason I start a factory that produces only cups that are glued onto tables, right? I would actually stop on some level I refer to it as a unit or a widget or whatever. I wouldn't say cup and table anymore, because it wouldn't be. It would be one thing, because that would be the useful word of reference. But in general, it's not useful to refer to the pair of them. It's useful to refer to the cup and the table. They have separate functions, but function is defined by me. It's according to what I find functional, right? So there's an act of free will in every eidos. Like in an eidos, there is an arbitrary cutoff of gestalt of what I'm going to call a cat and what I'm not.
Yeah. Like there's an ontological subjectivity that is imposed by an act of free will, right?
Yep. And that's why it's difficult to describe exactly, because it is an act of will. It's not baked into the world. It's actually in me, in my sense of utility.
It could also just be that it's such a deeply intuitive, base layer neural process that we don't even understand how it works, right?
Yeah, but I mean, again, you can readily imagine some super modern piece of furniture or object that you look at it, right, and you're not immediately sure what it is, right, and then you see someone sit on it, and you're like, oh, it's a chair, right, and you're like, okay, I didn't quite get that actually. It was such a bizarre shape that the shape itself didn't tell me that this was a chair, but now that I've seen someone use it, that function now means that I can name this as a chair. It has I recognize now the eidos of a chair in this object, which I didn't before, right? Because I hadn't seen it used. And if I tried to use it as a table or something, then I'd be like, this is a really shitty table, right? Because I got there are cases where you may misperceive in the shape of something does not tell you the correct eidos because you haven't captured it correctly, right? That just shows that it's not in the thing, it's in us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right, man. I really do have to go
Cool.
now.
All right.
But
We'll break.
great talk.
Yep. Absolutely. Next time. Stop.
All right, dude.